Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Prue Klein, and I'm the Marketing Coordinator here at Wine Communicators of Australia. Today, we'll be hearing from Larry Lockshin, Professor of Wine Marketing, the Ehrenberg Bass Institute for Marketing Science. In this webinar, Larry will be talking about the benefits of linking wines with the same brand names together through their packaging based on years of research. We have allowed plenty of time for any questions you may have to be answered at the end of the webinar. However, feel free to send them through to me as they come to mind. You can do this via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. As usual, this webinar will be recorded and a link to this recording will be sent to you should you wish to watch the content again at a later time. It is now my pleasure to hand over to Larry for his presentation.
Hello, everyone. So, Prue, you can hear me all good? Just say, yep, good. Welcome. It's kind of strange. We're used to lecturing now to screens, so I'm talking to a screen. But as Prue said earlier, if you have questions while I'm speaking, please go on to the Q&A. And if there are ones that for clarity or something, Prue will actually break in and ask me so that we can clarify anything you're not sure about. I just want to mention that Taylor Jeffrey's name is up here. Some of the, all the data and some of the slides came from her master's thesis, which she completed late last year. She's now working as a brand manager and is unable to help present today, but I want to recognize that she had a big part to play in the data that I'll be showing you a bit later. As you see, I'm from the Ehrenberg Bass Institute for Marketing Science, and for those of you who those of you who haven't heard of us, we are a research center at the University of South Australia. We're sponsored by about 70 large companies from around the world, so we don't just do wine. We do a lot of work with packaging. I've put up a few names here. Some of those you probably know and some you may not know, but the point is that our focus on research is to understand patterns, what we call empirical generalizations in marketing. So patterns that work just as well for Google as they work for CBS, as they work for Kohl's or Procter & Gamble or whatever. And so packaging, and many of these companies, of course, have consumer packages, but other ones don't. Many of these companies fund research into packaging specifically, and I'll be sharing just a little bit of that today. We have, of course, several detailed seminars on packaging and distinctive assets. So what we're going to talk about today briefly is I'll give a brief background on branding. I hope it's something that you've all heard before or aware of, but we'll start with some standardized things about branding and consumer purchasing. And then I'm going to talk just for about 10 minutes on memory. And what I mean by memory is consumer memory, because most decisions to buy something are a combination of conscious and unconscious prompting. And so by understanding a little bit about how memory works and how what we call distinctive assets, which I'll explain in a little bit, leads us to understand better how consumers make choices, and then, of course, how you can incorporate those learnings into your branding. Then I'll present a few slides on Taylor's recent work on branding consistency across Australian wines, and then we'll end up with some recommendations and any questions or discussion we might want to have. So most of you know this, but I think it's important to realize that there's over 2,200 small, medium, and large wine producers in Australia. And of course, the numbers, it's shaped like a pyramid. There's numbers, lots of small ones, fewer medium, and only about 20 very large wine producers. But among these 2,000 wineries, there's at least 10,000, probably more than that, wine brands, 60 plus regions. And going into a store, if it's a very large, big box store, it could have 1,500 or 2,000 wines on the shelf. Even the smaller wine shops will have 300 or 400 wines. And the result of that is it's a fragmented market. If you look at the toothpaste counter and the toothpaste shelving in your retail store or detergents or whatever, you're going to see maybe 8 or 10 brands, 2 or 3 will have the most shelf space and a few smaller ones. But the wine industry is quite confusing for consumers. And just briefly, you know, what's a brand? Well, the brand, of course, is the product, but it's also the packaging, the name, the promotions, the communications, and how it's presented to the consumer, whether it's through festivals, whether it's through direct marketing, cellar door, all those things are part of the brand, and they help, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, they help create memories, or at least what we might call associations in memory that make the product easier to apply. And quoting my old friend Tony Spotton, a wine brand is the encapsulation of the intellectual property of a winery, and sometimes includes the region, and forms the basis of its marketing focus. And it's the brand that ensures the future earnings, because that is what a consumer buys. So really, I mean, I started, many of you probably don't know, but I started off life in the 1970s as a viticulturalist. That's what I studied in my master's. And I like to talk about wine brands and branding like planting a vineyard. You're in it for the long term. You prepare properly, you prepare the soil properly, you buy the right varieties, you put them in the right place, you train them, all those things properly. And branding is like that. It's not something you just do or change because a whim strikes you or someone says your package isn't very good or whatever. It's a long-term process. And I think that's important for us to think about. So what's the purpose of branding? Well, of course, it's to identify the product, and that goes both for consumers, but also for the trade. It's a form of legal ownership, so that brand is typically copyrighted and measured and registered so that others can't take it. And of course, it makes consumers or customers able to identify your product. And what we'll be talking about today is it makes the product easy to find and to choose. And as I said, that part of the choosing is subconscious. And I've done research, which I won't be reporting today, but we've done research on manipulating things like the color and logos and things. And we know that consumers take very, very few seconds when they stand in front of a shelf to reach out and purchase something. And a lot of that is based on their memory structures and is what we might call subconscious purchasing. And the branding, of course, communicates the brand identity. We won't be talking about that today, but there's very fascinating research about brand identity and how now recent research is even showing how different colors and logos and forms can communicate subconsciously what the taste of the wine, the expected taste, not the taste, but what consumers might expect when they taste a wine. So here at Ehrenberg Bass, when we talk about good branding, we talk about 3 parts of good branding. One is the presence, or what we call the prominence of the brand. Is it there? Can you see it? Is it on the shelf? Is it online? Is it on wine lists? And is it identifiable? Does it look like your brand? When I say you, I mean your brand. Do people understand when they see it, whether it's the name or logos or colors? Do they identify the brand properly? And what we'll be focusing on today is it consistent both across different media and across time? And we'll be talking now today about within a brand portfolio, but those 3, presence, identity, and consistency, are what we talk to our corporate sponsors about to create good branding. And for us is, can people easily identify your brand when it's on the shelf, online, or on wine lists? Do they know what it is when they see it? So there's 2 types of branding which are used simultaneously. What we call direct branding, that's very simple, that's the brand name. And if you're using it in commercials, or if you're using it in advertising online or whatever, showing it, or even saying the brand name. When you have videos, I'll take just a very brief side here. We've done research on 30-second commercials that shows within 30 seconds, if you can mention or show the brand or say the brand name 3 times in 30 seconds. That is, you don't need to do it more than that, but up 3 times is the best level to get people to remember your brand. So you might think about that when you're doing videos that you're posting on your website or videos you're sending to your trade partners, that even though they know who you are, showing or saying the brand name is important. What we're going to focus on a bit more today is what we call indirect branding. And indirect branding, we call these distinctive assets. These are everything except the brand name. It could be your logos, the color of your font, the font itself. It can be characters like cartoon characters or sub-brand characters. Some wineries separate the brands in their portfolios by slightly different labels. All of these things are what we call distinctive assets. And I'll talk in a few minutes why those are so important, in fact, as important as the brand name. So we have direct branding, showing or saying the brand name, and what we call indirect branding, which is conveying the brand name, linking it to other types of, in this case for wine, mainly visual, package-based distinctive assets. So why does this matter? Well, using non-brand name elements have the possibility to communicate to consumers different ways. You can communicate in a sign using your colors, using your logos. You can communicate on a web page. You can communicate on the shelf. You can even communicate when you talk to customers, when they log on to your website, by using those same distinctive assets on uniforms, on your vehicles, on anything you do. Those multiple touch points can be communicated besides just with the brand name. And what I think is very important is that our brains, about 50% of our capacity in our brains are for graphical or visual processing. So nonverbal cues, visual cues, and sometimes auditory. We're not talking about commercials today or auditory cues, but these are often less strenuous for the brain to process. Our brains process them quicker, they bring them to mind quicker, and they have a stronger effect often in people choosing your wine over another wine. And as I'll talk in the next few slides, these indirect branding elements give you a greater chance of penetrating the memory instead of being filtered out unconsciously. Because if somebody doesn't recognize what your wine packaging looks like, if they say they just don't recognize it, they walk right by it. And we've done, and others have done, plenty of tests on supermarket and other kind of shelves where consumers will walk right by brands that they're not familiar with and look at the brands that they're familiar with. So distinctive assets must be unique. You can see across the top something that's pretty well known. We don't do much of this in Australia. A few wineries do this, but the picture of the chateau. I remember when I was in France, now it's been about almost 20 years since I did a sabbatical there, and you go into the supermarket and they might have a 10-meter long row of wines, and depending which region you're in, they'll have wines from that region. But so many of them have pictures of some sort of winery building, chateau-like building on the front. And you'll choose some wines, you take them home, drink them, and say, oh, that one was pretty good. You go back to the store, you can't remember because the labels look the same. So colorful characters, especially color itself, can be quite important for creating what we call distinctiveness. We differentiate, I want to use that word, we make a difference in our research between differentiation, which says my wine is different or my product is different, to distinctive. My product is distinctive. It stands on its own. It can be identified. We know many consumers and many experts can't distinguish wines, or they can distinguish them, but they can't tell you which wines that are not really differentiable when you taste them. But the labels and packaging can be distinctive, and that's what we're shooting for here. So I'm going to use the word DA, distinctive assets, and you can see along the right hand of your screen, these are brands. We've changed the name. We're not using the brand name at all, but I think all of you could tell us what those brands are, even though the words they spell are not the brand name. This is what we're talking about, increasing the number of signals in any communication where the color and the font actually increases those number of signals. And we call this neuro-richness. It actually works in different parts of the consumer's memory, not just always through the color, and the fonts and all that are processed slightly differently. So it gives what we call richness, but an important type of richness that helps identify the brand, or at least bring the brand to mind. And as long as you know what your distinctive assets are and you maintain those in all of your promotions or all of your online materials or all of your emails or posts, whatever you're doing, long as you keep those specific distinctive assets, you can be very creative about everything else. But keeping those the same is really the goal to creating and then maintaining consumer recognition of your brand. So I've already said some of these, so I'm not going to repeat them. I think this slide probably is extraneous, but it does allow your brand to be remembered and not filtered out, especially when someone visits your winery. It's really important. We're not going to talk much about this, but I'll mention it today. When you have visitors at your winery, you know you have a captive audience, but your branding should be really evident during that visit or on that web page when people are visiting you virtually, because that helps create a memory that has both color and other distinctive assets linked to it that will help bring that brand up into awareness during a purchase situation. We call that salience, when a brand comes to mind in a purchase situation. So by doing that, anytime a consumer is encountering your brand, especially when they're physically visiting you, wearing the shirt with the logo on it, having that logo as well as your brand in the cellar door, having it on your signage, are all really, really good ways to create and build those memories. So this is based, what I'm talking about now is based on what we call associative network theories. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but just say that anytime you have an experience, consuming a product, seeing a product, talking about a product, and of course, all your other experiences as well, you write a little bit into your memory. The stronger the experience, the wine you served at your wedding, or the wine you had at your 10th anniversary, or that great visit and dinner you had, those really emotional experiences create stronger memories. But even the purchasing of a wine creates a small memory. And what our brains are, it's not one memory in one chunk. These are in different chunks in your brain. And the more you can associate the brand name, what you call your wine, with these different distinctive assets, the more touch points or associations you have in your memory, the more likely that brand is to come to mind, or what we say become salient when someone's wanting to buy something in a specific situation. So we know this associative network works. We know that links are strengthened like exercise through use, like strengthening your muscles. The more people see those links when you say the brand, show the brand, have the color, have the logo, they help build those links, which allow them to be brought up into memory more easily. And that's why you see the same boring ads on TV over and over again. Even if you're not paying a lot of attention to them, they're helping renew and cement the links for those brands. You're probably not buying a car tomorrow, but there's a lot of car ads around. But you see and glance at those ads, that helps build the memory traces, the associations, that when you decide to buy a car, what brands come to mind? What brands will you actually take a look at? And that's what associative network theory is about. So we'll pick a brand, very well known brand, Wolf Blass. That's the name of the brand, the direct brand, and the indirect, one of the indirect aspects of that brand is the Wolf Blass Eagle. And it's in Eagle Hawk, the one sub-brand that is actually linked very clearly even to the name. And if you look in the center, Wolf Blass is not about nautical themes, but the anchor is the brand name Wolf Blass, and that can have links in memory to the person, Wolf Blass, and we all know Wolf was and is very good at promoting himself, his own picture, his own personality, and you may like it or not like it, but it is a way of creating another association in memory that helps people bring that memory to mind. You've got the logo, and then you've got specific colors, and he was one of the first to link those colors to different parts of his brand range. And you can see if you change any of these, if you change the color, or you change your logo image, or you make it small so people can't see it, you actually reduce the links and reduces the ability for what we call spreading activation. When someone sees one aspect, whether it's the distinctive asset, whether it's the color, whether it's the person, whatever it is, that then links to the other memories in your brain, which help you bring that to mind. And when you change these things, you snap that link. And of course, then you have to start over training the consumer, teaching the consumer, building those associations again between these different aspects and your brand. Okay, that's enough for spreading activation. Let's look at very briefly a couple slides on brand architecture. Wine companies very clearly, almost all of them have what we call vertical and horizontal brand ranges. A vertical range having wines at different price points. And of course, there's higher price points in the Penfolds than these, but I just picked those. It's what fit on my screen. And that's a vertical range. We'll talk about that in a second. And then there's the horizontal range where everything is at the same price, but you've got typically different varieties, could be different vineyards or whatever, but all at the same price. So what is it about a vertical brand range? The assumption is if you have wines at different price points, you're assuming that there are hierarchical segments. There are people who will prefer to buy wines at say $12, $18, and people who will spend $50 or $80 or whatever for your higher priced wines. And you're assuming those are slightly different people. In fact, that is a good assumption. We've done some analysis that shows people buying wine, say at $12, $15, when they want to buy a special wine, they tend to move up 1 or 2 price points. They move up from 12 to 15 to maybe 20, 25, but they don't move to 50. So if somebody's tending to buy wines at 20, 25, they'll move to 30, 40, 50. So people don't tend to move from a $10 range to a $100 or $80 range. But so there are what we would call hierarchical segments. If you're calling it a vertical brand range, in other words, it's all the same brand, you're assuming that the brand image that you're creating can cross those different hierarchical price points. I won't spend a lot of time on that today, but that is the reason why some brands have opted to create a different range and a different name and look for their very high-priced wines to separate them from their lower-priced. And that's the typical Toyota versus Lexus type of ranging. I think wineries that have very low-priced wines in the, say, $8 or $10 range have struggled more to move up that vertical range than wineries that have had higher-priced wines have been a bit able to move a bit further down, but not down to that $8 to $10 price point. And of course, you're saying when you have a vertical price range that there are discernible differences between the wines at different prices. They don't all taste the same. In a horizontal range, you're assuming that there's a range of preferences at a certain price point. And that's a very good assumption. Some people prefer white, some prefer red, some prefer rosé, Some will prefer a Shiraz to a Cabernet, and that's pretty reasonable to assume. It also assumes that there's a similar price quality relationship as we go across that brand range, but also assumes that you'll have some cannibalization. Sometimes people will buy your Shiraz and not buy your Cabernet, and you're probably happier for them to do that than to buy someone else's Shiraz or Cabernet, which is that defense against others. So there are different concepts for range packaging. I'm not specifically picking on this winery, Alpha Box and Dice, but there are wineries who have quite unique packaging for each of the wines in their range. The key here is the little bit of label across the top of the bottle, across the neck of the bottle, or over top of the neck, the Alpha Box and Dice, as compared to, say, a Ehrenberg, where the labels can be quite different in what they're showing, but you see the red stripe and you see the Ehrenberg name and logo across all of those bottles. So our question, and what I'm going to go into now with our research, is how many distinctive assets are similar across a range of wines and which ones matter? So this is actually what we would call empirical evidence that we tested within the Australian wine industry. So to answer these questions, we did some research on the consistency of attributes across ranges within what we might call brand families. So given that it was a master's thesis, Taylor chose 60 different brands to measure. There were 20 from large wineries, which was pretty much almost all the largest wineries, 20 medium-sized wineries, and 20 small wineries. And we measured 5 wines from each of those wineries. I'll tell you a bit more about how we chose those in a minute. They had to be sold at retail in Australia for a couple reasons. One, we had to have access to the labels, and if they're sold at retail, it's easy to see the labels. And also we wanted wines who supposedly are trying to be recognized on the shelf because they're being sold at retail. We counted the number of distinctive assets, or not distinctive assets, but the number of attributes on the label, and we measured both the direct and indirect ones. And we measured, when I say measured, we actually used Photoshop to measure the number of pixels, the amount of pixels dedicated to each of these branding elements, so we could say so much of the label was this, so much of the label was that. We also counted measures, what we would call non-brand elements, like region, grape variety, country of origin. Those are things, metals, those are things that are on wineries, but they're not distinctive because there's plenty of wines from each wine region, from each grape variety. And we only measured the front label because we were looking at wines at retail. So the sampling frame, we took wines from the Australia New Zealand Wine Industry Directory, of course, and we categorized wineries small, between 5 and 20,000 cases, medium 20 to 99,999 cases, and large 100,000 cases or more. And we chose 5 SKUs from each winery at different price points, at least 3 different price points from each winery, sometimes more depending on how hierarchical their price range was. And we decided to keep the measures to the top 13 wine regions and the top 10 grape varieties in Australia, just so that we would have at least somewhat uniform set of wines people could choose from. So let's look at some of our results. It's not surprising, small, medium, large, 96% of the wineries had the brand on the front label, but it might be surprising that 5% did not even have the brand name on the front label. We also can see that the font and the logo image, as well as any sub-brand elements, were more common, statistically more common, on large winery bottles than they were on small winery bottles. So only, say, 60% of small wineries had a logo image across their different, the different wines, the 5 wines that we chose, whereas 80% of large wineries had the same thing. The fonts, large wineries had 91% of them had the same font across all their the 5 that we chose, where only 78% of small wineries had that. So we look at wine attributes. Well, more wineries had the variety on the label than had their brand name on the label, only slightly. Interestingly, medium-sized wineries were more likely to have the region than smaller, large wineries, and country of origin was more often found on large wineries on the front label, on the back label, obviously on some other wineries in our test. And wine awards, none of the small wineries we chose had a label, had awards like medals or trophies on the front, whereas a few percent, not that many, had them of the large wineries. So if we look at this, I think this is an interesting slide. So on the left-hand side, you can see what percent of wineries had the variety, 98% across all wineries. Direct branding, in other words, the brand name, the region, logo image, sub-brand, another image, only 37% had another image, country of origin, 18%, award, 2%. But if we look at the right-hand side, these percentages are how much of the label was occupied by these. So an image that was not the logo was the biggest actual image, biggest actual percent of the label. 27% of the label was covered by some image. Awards were quite large when they were on there. Logo image down to 7%. The brand name, I find this very interesting myself. The brand name, only 5% of the label was dedicated to the brand name, and 5% to a sub-brand, 3% to the region, 2% to the variety. So really small percent of the label is actually has anything besides an image on it. So I've already said that. So what's a label made of? Well, the label itself is about 38% of the bottle on average. Sub-brand 5%, as we said. Direct branding, the brand name, only 5%. Logo 7%. The region 3%. The variety 2%. Another image of some sort, 27%. And then the rest of the label, 50% of the label could be the background or typically blank, or the borders, or whatever background colors. So the background color could be part of the branding or the distinctive assets, but in most cases it was, as this label shows you, an off-white or just a standard color, not linked to the brand at all. So for example, here's Fox Creek. Their Red Baron has what we would call an other image, has an image of the Red Baron's airplane on the front, whereas the rest of their wines have the Fox Creek name. Of course, that's on both, but have the picture or the logo of the fox on their label. So that's what we mean by other image versus the logo image. Quite small, a lot of white space, probably could have the brand name bigger and easier to see in what I've talked about earlier about calling to memory and calling to mind. And the brand on the left, the Red Baron, certainly is visible, whereas the Fox Creek is much, much less visible. It's easier to see on the right-hand side, though the Chardonnay and the region are quite small. So if we want to look at branding consistency, in other words, we had a score that we developed, and this is not an academic talk, so I'm not going to go into the scoring systems we used or whatever, but you can see that there really was no difference. On average, small, medium, and large wineries were about 75% consistent. Their score across each of these brand elements was consistent across small, medium, and large wineries. So we thought maybe large wineries, because they employed professional label designers and professional brand managers, they might have higher consistency scores than small wineries, but our evidence shows that that really wasn't the case. So we did some regressions, and again, I'm not going to go into the technical side of how we did our regressions, but the logo presence and the main color were the two things, the logo presence and the color of the image that was being used accounted for about 80% of the variation. So in other words, because of the small size of brand names and the small size of many of the other things, it's really the logo and the colors of the image across the different wines within a brand's portfolio that drove what we would call the similarity or consistency index in our research. Now, some of you might ask, and I know I see there's a question out there, how does this relate to consumer choice? Because these were measures, quote, in the lab. We're counting pixels and using trained experts to make these decisions. We just collected data using the same 60 brands with consumers and asked them, looking at a screen of 5 brands from each winery, how consistent they felt each of those brand families were. And maybe next year in a seminar, we'll be able to report that. Certainly I'll be able to report it in some of the columns that I write, is how the consumer judgments fit with these more technical judgments. So we'll get to the questions in just a second. Our key finding was that, well, one was branding did not, consistency did not vary really across the size of the wine brand. Logo image and the image color account for really the consistency across brand families. And that would be things like the red stripe on Ehrenberg or the red Penfolds graphic that I showed in that earlier slide. Those are the kind of consistencies in colors that would account across a range. Branding is more prominent on the pack relative to other wine attributes, and that's good. We would hope that the brand name would be larger and easier to see. But going back to what I talked about before, colors and logos are easier to identify, and they perhaps could also be increased on the label. Font, sub-brands, and logos are used more frequently on large wine brand labels than on small wine brand labels. And small brands may think, well, maybe it's not so important. I'm not on the shelf in wine shops so much. I'm really sold mainly through restaurants, and I'm sold it direct through my cellar door and through my webpage, and I sell at festivals and things. But if you want to build that consistency and you want to build what we might call the memory associations, then using logos and colors is very, very important. Small wine brands have the brand name larger, which I think is a good thing. Large wine brands present the logo that larger. Both of those, I think, are good things. Perhaps bigger is better in this case. And I know this is often a fight between the graphic designer who likes the way different things are going, different ways your label can look, and they like that empty space, which they say, brings out some of the facets of the brand image. But if people can't recognize your brand, then they're not going to buy it. We also saw that there was very little regional associations being built. The region is often quite small on labels. I think our own research shows that people do equate regions to styles, especially the more involved customers. So they're looking for a Barossa Shiraz or a Coonawarra Cabernet. So having that region identifiable on the label is important. But when we talked to another master's student I had a couple of years ago who did some research on how wine stores choose which wines to put on their shelf, the wine stores were not all that concerned with region. They were concerned with the flavor, the strength, the individuality of the wine, and of course, it's what they thought of was good packaging, which is maybe different than what we're measuring here today. So what would be our recommendations? Over time, work towards greater consistency across the different SKUs, the stock keeping units, and across your ranges. This is the leverage that you can use to build greater mental availability over time. Yes, consumers need to differentiate or find distinctive your higher price from your lower priced wines, and that can be done through a separate color. It can be done through a separate kind of brand image or brand logo, as long as the distinctive assets, the key things are the same across. There's something tying your wines together. And sub-brands, unless you're very clearly want to create something unique, they should appear as part of the overall brand. And the size of the font for the brand name and the size of the logos should be similar across those ranges. If you want to make unique sub-brands, certainly you can, but you're not going to get the same leverage, where does the leverage come from? It comes from those associations in the consumer's memory. It comes from building those associations so they come to mind in a certain purchase situation. And finally, I have two final recommendations. One is don't make changes quickly. If you're going to make changes, make them subtly over maybe a 5-year plan to increase your brand name size, to change the colors. Don't go cold turkey, because consumers will you'll break those associations and they won't recognize you at all. But I would suggest expanding your branding consistency to all your activities, to your website, your social media. Use those same distinctive assets and your brand name across all of them, across any promotions that you do, signage, uniforms, email, delivery vehicles, whatever. I know it seems kind of boring to you because you see this stuff every day, but it's not boring to the consumer. In fact, it's very, very important. So I think I've used my time and for that, and now we have some time for questions. Thank you, Prue, and all of you who are sitting in and watching.
Yeah, thank you so much, Larry. And I'm sure there are plenty of brand managers and marketing managers sitting there, and their minds are just flooded with ideas and looking at their own brands and their wine ranges and how they can apply some of that insight and learning. So thank you so much. We do have a question that's come in, and it is, how do you balance the need for consistency and drive to stay contemporary? Which wins, or is it best to evolve in small increments?
Of course, I think I answered that, but I will say the drive to be contemporary is probably something put in people's minds by graphic designers. And I'm not picking on graphic designers. And if your brand is old-fashioned, and listen, that's great because it means you've been around for a long, long time. And we know with branding, older brands really have a much more, I'll say it a different way, they have stronger associations because they've been around a long time. So if you're going to make an older brand like a Penfolds Contemporary, and I'm not picking on them, but if you looked at their branding, you look at Jacob's Creek, some of these brands have been around quite a long period of time, you can see they have done it in small steps over a period of years. Penfolds has cleaned up their label. It's more white space. It's not so cluttered. Jacob's Creek has done much of the same thing, but both of them have maintained the font of their brand name and the color of their brand name. And Jacob's Creek, well, they've mucked around with their logo a bit, and I don't have any testing to say whether it's worked or not, but I do know that we've done research with some big consumer product companies, and you would think, and I'll use this today, you would think that something like Lipton Tea, which is a very, very big brand in the US, not as big here in Australia, that if you kept the word Lipton Tea, but you changed the color of your packaging to show black tea versus herbal or green tea, that would be great. Consumers would love it. But what happened when they did that? People said, I can't find my tea on the shelf. It's right there, but they couldn't find it because the color had changed. So incremental changes definitely over time. Contemporary, well, you know, do you have evidence that your buyers won't buy you because you don't look contemporary? I don't think there's a lot of evidence for those things myself.
Excellent. Thank you, Larry. I've got a couple more questions for you. Are there any particular colours that consumers gravitate to based on your research to date?
Well, we've done research on this a number of years ago, and there are colors that consumers gravitate towards, but the strongest ones that have the most consumer interest also repel other consumers just as much. So orange is a color that some consumers really love and some hate, which is why if you don't want to, I wouldn't say the word upset, but if you don't want consumers to kind of stamp back, then you end up with kind of bland colors or standard colors, you know, the reds or the blue. You don't see many blues on wine labels, but there's no evidence that there are any single colors or groups of colors that are attractive. The key here is identification. You know, we would look at some of the branding that we see today on wines and say, gosh, I'd never if I were starting a winery today, I'd never do that. And you probably wouldn't. You know, Penfolds probably wouldn't have that label today if they were starting a brand new winery. But, you know, they've got, you know, 100 years of being in the market. They're not going to change it. And I'd say that to any winery. You know, you can use color to be identifiable. So this is the color we use, but I don't think you know, I think it's about consumer learning, not consumer liking your color, to be honest with you.
Excellent. Were there any best case examples that you could refer to in terms of excellent use of distinctive assets?
Well, I think, you know, we didn't, you know, there were a number of wineries that scored 100%. And I think you've seen some of them. Ehrenberg, that red stripe. I mean, again, would you put a red stripe? Most graphic designers wouldn't because it's old fashioned. But people recognize that. I like the one with the, you know, the stripe. That's what I get. If you look at the Ehrenberg logo closely, it's a generic looking logo. It kind of looks, you know, Henschke will get after me if I say it looks like the Henschke logo, but it doesn't. But from far away, they kind of look like an old fashioned logo. So, you know, the logo has to be distinctive for people to be able to recognize it. I think Penfolds have done a very good job at maintaining that font and that color. And of course, because it's so, in a sense, simplistic, they've been easy to imitate in places like China, you know, for fake Penfolds, even calling it Benfolds or some other name, but using that font because it is recognizable. So I think there's, you know, a reasonable number of good examples. I think some wineries try to stretch their branding too far, and that means that they change their logo, they change the fonts, and I think over time people will learn to go with it, but it's disruptive to consumer learning when you do that.
Yeah, interesting. We've got one last question, unless anyone's going to quickly type in some extra ones. But do you see any significant difference in consumer choices on branding versus trade buyers?
Well, I haven't seen, well, I say I haven't done any label work with that, so packaging work with that. Work we've done with trade buyers, and for those people who are, well, all of you are Australian wineries, so you have access to the Wine Australia website. We published some research about a year ago where we tested consumers and trade in the US using the same measurement techniques. Now, this wasn't labels or anything like that, looking at, for the trade, using exactly the same measurement, for the trade, adding a wine to their portfolio, to the consumers buying a wine, And there were a lot of similarities between those two groups in what was driving their choices. They weren't identical, and interestingly, we were able to create 3 segments of trade and 3 segments of consumers that actually fit together. So I think when you're with the trade and the research we've done, and I'm sure most of you have lots of experience with this, they want packaging that's acceptable to them, that they think will be recognizable and distinctive, but they want all the other things that trade wants. They want to make sure that you're going to promote your wines. They want the distinctive tastes of your wines. They want to know the quality levels. They want pricing that's going to move the wines. They want promotional dollars. Most of those things are not of that much interest to consumers. But I would just say, trade are people too. They react to the same things. And of course, if you make changes to your packaging, you've got to convince the trade first to restock that before you trying to convince the consumer. So you've got kind of a double-barreled thing there going.
Yeah. Very true. And I think, as I said before, I think everyone's got lots to go away and think about. Larry, we don't have any further questions. Did you have anything final to say before we wrap the webinar up?
No, I think there's nothing bigger to go about, but, if you have very distinctive labels that are different among your wines, those wineries can be very successful too. So don't go out and say, oh my gosh, my labels all have to be changed. It's just something to work towards for the longer run. And of course, if all your wine or majority of your wine is sold through your direct marketing, it's a little less important than if your wines are on wine lists or on sale through generic websites like other portals, or they're on sale at retail stores. There the packaging becomes super important. So that's all I have to say. Thank you all for tuning in during this beautiful harvest day in Australia, right?
Absolutely. Larry, we've got one final question that's just come in, if you don't mind.
I don't mind, sure.
Okay, great. There is a lot of talk about new bottle sizes and shapes making inroads in distinguishing packaging. Do you have any insights on these trends?
Well, we have a simulated choice experiment going to field in a week, looking at different packaging, alternative packaging types and sizes, because I think this is, I think the 750 glass bottle, it's been around for maybe, 300-400 years. It hasn't outlived its usefulness entirely, but we're beginning to realize that the bottle itself has issues with carbon content, but also too big for some, not big enough for others, where sizes can make, real inroads. But the question here today is about packaging. Is it distinctive to bottle your wine in a distinctive bottle, a smaller bottle, a larger bottle, a different package? And the answer is that can be distinctive. And certainly some regions and some wineries have proprietary bottles that are identifiable. I'm starting to see more 500 ml bottles, not a lot, but of course the cost per milliliter is much higher for smaller glass bottles than for other containers. So I think we're going to see some other containers like cans and things on the market for certain occasions, not for every occasion, not for aging wine or whatever, but will it be distinctive? The answer is in the short term, yes. But if it takes off in marketing, imitation is the best form of flattery. And I would expect if something takes off, if 500 ml packages take off, everybody will start doing it once they take off.
Yeah. Very good points. Thanks so much, Larry, for your time. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today. WCA's next webinar will be held on Tuesday, the 13th of April, presented by Rowena Curlew from Denomination, an international drinks branding specialist company. She'll talk about the latest developments in sustainable wine packaging from that design perspective. So very much will flow on from Larry's presentation today. Registrations for that one will be open on the WCA website later today. For WCA members, all recordings from previous webinars are held on our website in the members section, and anything that's Wine Australia sponsored are available via the WCA YouTube station. Please go to our website to find out more about these recordings. And finally, if you have any suggestions on webinar topics you'd like us to cover in this year's program, please email me at wca@winecommunicators.com.au. Thanks again for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Larry.